Today, I want to talk about neoliberalism. Woo! Before I've been asked, what are my thoughts on neoliberalism? People have asked me to do a video on neoliberalism. And the odd thing about neoliberalism is while I do not consider myself a neoliberal, I consider myself a radical for capitalism. I do think that neoliberals often get unfairly scapegoated and smeared from people across the so called political spectrum. Socialists, especially, hate neoliberals, but I even see populists and conservatives on the right hating on neoliberals. And for a while, I've been following this account on Twitter called Neoliberal, spelled with a zero in place of the O. Has over 76,000 followers on Twitter. They have a Twitch stream, which we are live on right now. They also have podcasts. One thing I've noticed about neoliberals is one thing I like is that they tend to focus on positive values. They often remind people that, despite everything that might be wrong with the world and the country, there's still a lot to be happy about. There's still a lot of progress being made. So a lot of good trends that we should stop and appreciate once in a while. I don't see neoliberals motivated by fear and doom and gloom. That's another thing you see a lot these days, just doom and gloom. From the left, you see a lot of doom and gloom. They say, look at the right wing. They're full of a bunch of mobs who want to steal elections. They're full of racists and bigots and nationalists. They want to impose their religion on you. They want to make it easier for a big greedy corporation to exploit you and exploit the working class. Is that what you want? No. Then vote for us and give us more power. Meanwhile, on the right, they'll point to the left and say, man, look how horrible the left is. It's Antifa burning stuff down. They want to bring about socialism. They're led by evil big tech monopolies. They're full of groomers that want to impose woke ideology on your kids. They want to flood the country with illegal immigrants. Is that what you want? Is that what you want? A globalist, socialist, George Soros backed establishment? No. Then vote for us and give us more power. Meanwhile, the neoliberals, from what I see, they're often like, hey, slow down. Wouldn't it be nice if we lifted some red tape so that we can build some affordable apartments, build some new condominium complexes, maybe build some new nuclear power plants? From what I see, neoliberals, they are mixed economy moderates who favor capitalism when it comes to issues like housing policy and international trade and immigration and maybe a few other issues. They seem to think that capitalism is a force for good in the world. Now they as radical for capitalism as I would like them to be. Definitely not. But I think in today's political climate, neoliberals are definitely amongst the good guys. Think about it like you're entering a food court after not eating anything for well over 24 hours and you're hungry, you want some food. And the food court you're at, 90% of the food court options are just vendors offering straight up poison and snake oil. But then you notice in the back, one of the vendors in this restaurant, they're offering pineapple pizza. And you might think to yourself, is it my favorite pizza? No, but I'll probably still enjoy it. And at the very least, I know it won't kill me. Neoliberalism. It's the pineapple pizza in today's political climate. Anyway, enough with my backhanded compliments. Maybe everything I just said was wrong, but we're going to find out because today I brought a neoliberal on to ask him about these sorts of questions. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my guest for today, the neoliberal Jeremiah Johnson. Welcome to the program, Jeremiah.
Thanks for having me, Kirk. That was an excellent introduction. So thank you so much.
I hope you like pineapple pizza, but let's get started today. My question is, what is neoliberalism?
Well, obviously, it's the ideology that's destroying the world, as you noted. But no, so neoliberalism in its simplest form is just one of the many branches of liberal political philosophy. And this is, we can get into a lot more about what specifically neoliberals believe and what they don't believe and what are kind of the defining issues. But the first thing to note is that neoliberalism falls under the big tent of liberalism, whether you consider yourself a classical liberal or a kind of modern social liberal of like the US Democratic Party type, or a libertarian, or even all the way to being like a social democrat kind of. All of these, I think, fall under the big tent of political philosophical liberalism, and neoliberals identify under that tent. What distinguishes a neoliberal from any other kind of liberal? I would say there's an emphasis on capitalism as a force for good, but not as the only force for good. Neoliberals tend to believe in both that that capitalism creates a lot of wealth, but that there's also a role for the state in terms of redistributing some of that wealth. Neoliberals tend to have a focus on, I would say, what I would call globalism, very pro-immigration, very pro-trade, very pro-international institutions and international cooperation. The belief that kind of internationalism is a force for good in the world through a lot of these things. And there's a lot more you could get into as well, but I would say that's kind of a 2 to 3 minute introduction about what neoliberals believe.
Yeah, there's some stuff there I want to address, notably globalism, because I think globalism, from people who use it as a smear, they often use it as a package deal. Like, I'm for international trade, and I think as we've seen the last few years, restrictions on international trade, they've caused a lot of problems, notably with the recent baby formula shortage. We noticed when we started imposing sanctions on Russia, it caused a lot of problems with our oil and gasoline markets. It's even having an impact on the housing market, from what I've talked about a lot. But a lot of people will package international trade with people who maybe want a one world government and institutions like the United Nations, which I am no fan of, so to speak. But yeah, I think another disagreement would be I would disagree that we should have forced wealth redistribution, but I don't really want to like hammer you over all the disagreements we might have. But yeah, you talked about the big tents. I've seen a lot of
Yeah.
I'm
Sorry, I'm in New York City, so there's there's an ambulance right outside.
Yeah, it's the neoliberals running around with their sirens. Way to go. Good work. But I've seen free market economists like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. They're lumped in with neoliberals, along with presidents from both parties like Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. I've even seen Barack Obama lumped in with neoliberals. So, which thinkers and historical figures would you consider neoliberal? A lot of people might say, well, how can Bill Clinton and Barack Obama be in the same tent with Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman? Would you say that there's still like maybe disagreements within neoliberalism that still need to be ironed out?
That's a great question as far as who counts as a neoliberal. And the first thing I would note here is that terms change over time. What a liberal is, for instance, changes depending on where you are in history and where you are in the world. A liberal in America and a liberal in Europe mean two different things. And again, apologies. This is just, I live in Midtown, so it happens sometimes. I'm going to give it a second. Oh, man.
That's what happens when neoliberals take over New York City.
Yeah. So the first thing is to note is that terms change over time. The history of the term neoliberal is actually very fascinating because it was invented kind of explicitly by some of these economic thinkers that you mentioned. Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman are a couple people who used to belong to what was called the Mont Pelerin Society. And they also met up at something famously called the Walter Lippmann Colloquium. And basically, this was collections of economists and academic thinkers who were getting together and trying to explore political philosophy. And specifically, they were doing this in the 30s and the 40s. And, you know, if you think about the history of the world at that time, what were the threats to liberalism in the 30s and the 40s? You had a bunch of people who were committed classical liberals at that time, but who were looking at the world and seeing the rise of Stalinist communism, actual Stalinism, not metaphorical Stalinism, actual Nazis in Germany, not metaphorical Nazis. And
And
so they saw
Mussolini.
liberalism that was failing. They thought, what, is liberalism up to the challenge of the modern age? So again, sorry, this is kind of impossible to plan around, but right as I'm in the middle of giving this incredibly eloquent, answer about liberalism, but so they saw this and they thought, literally, we need to reinvigorate liberalism. Liberalism needs a revival. We need a new liberalism to meet these challenges of Stalinism and Nazism. And so literally what they called it was neoliberalism. We need a new version of this. And that's how the term itself was born. And I take a lot of inspiration from that in terms of neoliberalism should be constantly reinventing itself, constantly trying to improve on the ideas of liberal philosophy. And so who precisely counts? Milton Friedman and Hayek are definitely neoliberals. Most neoliberals today would not believe the same things as Milton Friedman did 100%. They would say there's some areas of agreement, but also society has changed in the last 70 years or so, unsurprisingly, and the political solutions that worked for the 1950s are not necessarily the same solutions.
Uh-oh. You
That
still
are going to
there?
work in the 2020. Yeah.
Okay.
So, we could parse out exactly who counts as a neoliberal, who doesn't, but to me, that's not quite as interesting as the history of the word itself. Definitely some of the original thinkers were neoliberals. When you start to get into politics, sometimes it's like everybody to the right of like Bernie Sanders and to the left of Donald Trump is a neoliberal, which is not the most useful thing, to be like half of the Republican Party and 80% of Democrats are neoliberals. At that point, it's no longer really a very descriptive term, but yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of like trickle down economics, and that a lot of people do promote and advocate for what they would call trickle down economics, but you often see a lot of people just throw it out there as like a blanket smear for any economic policy. Like they'll say, "Oh, this is what happens when you embrace trickle down." I think even Joe Biden a few weeks ago tweeted something about how trickle down economics isn't working. You see that a lot with neoliberals. People just use it as like a blanket smear.
Yeah.
Would you say that neoliberals, what would you say their view is on America's founding and the Enlightenment? Because you're talking a lot about like the history of liberalism in general. Would you say that neoliberals have a positive view on the Enlightenment and America's founding? Is it indifferent? Is it negative?
Broadly positive. I don't think that there's any special relevance, to be honest, for the America's founding in particular to neoliberals, unless they happen to be American. The foundational roots of neoliberalism are not American. They were born out of particularly continental European economists, and with a particular bent towards Austrian and German economists. And this kind of branched in several directions. You had the Austrians that actually became Austrian economics after a while. People like Hayek leading into Mises and things like that. All of these guys were attending the same conferences where the term neoliberal was invented. They were all running in the same political circles. You also have, though, the kind of original German Ordo liberals, if you're familiar with that term, the people who invented the German social democratic state in the post-World War II era. Those people were also running around these conferences, the Walter Lippmann colloquium.
We're talking about West Germany, right?
Yes.
All right. Just want to make it clear.
German Ordo liberalism is basically the German version of kind of a capitalist liberal state, but with a strong welfare base, a strong social spending net. And all of these people, the ones who kind of drifted towards the left and created Ordo liberalism, the ones who drifted to the right and kind of created modern libertarianism, they were all attending, the same conferences, running in the same social circles, and hashing out these ideas in the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah, the reason why I asked that is because, 4th of July is actually coming up. Happy, early 4th of July, and, a lot of times I see this a lot more on the right with the more religious conservatives. They seem to increasingly have a negative view of America's founding. They package it in with liberalism in general, like Thomas Jefferson. I even saw, like, Lauren Boebert. She didn't say this about liberalism, but she like dismissed the idea that the founders were all about separation of church and state, which I would think is a secular liberal value. But from what I see from like the intellectuals on the right, they seem to have a negative view, a growing negative view of America's founding as this liberal democracy that we should be thinking positively. And then of course on the left, they also have a very negative view of America's founding. Would you say that neoliberalism would you say that neoliberalism leans left or right, or do you guys ignore the political spectrum and just try to focus on how you can achieve certain policy goals while working with maybe both sides?
Well, in again, it always depends on how you define left and right, because that by itself is a loaded question.
Yeah.
If you have the people who are like, well, technically AOC is a centrist, in any normal country anywhere in the world, and I don't think that's particularly true. But if you want to choose to frame it that way, I can't stop you from saying AOC is a centrist, and Joe Biden is a right winger. But uh, you know, that does I don't know. That's more. I can think that choice is not useful. You can't really definitionally be wrong. You're just using a definition that doesn't do much of anything. Um, but in a broad sense, I would say neoliberals are right leaning in that they are proud capitalists. If your definition of political right and left hinges on acceptance of capitalism versus socialism, then neoliberals are going to be proud capitalists and they would belong on the right. On the other hand, if your definition of left right depends on whether or not you approve of redistributive taxation, they would be on the left because for the most part we do. And there's a lot of particulars here, but I would say that we are not doctrinaire about the need for a purely socialistic approach or a purely laissez-faire, hands-off kind of libertarian approach. We think that there's merit to having markets do their work, having free market capitalism create wealth. There's also merit to government intervention at times. There are times where markets don't work particularly well. If you take economics classes, you've certainly read about market failures, and markets are very, very useful tools, but they don't always produce efficient outcomes. And so there's also going to be places where neoliberals are, interested in government intervention or redistribution.
Um, does neoliberalism, do they have an interest outside of the realm of politics? From what I can see, neoliberals are pretty secular while also not being really hostile to religion. Neoliberals also seem to be pro science and pro individualism. And also I guess are neoliberals, are they interested in a lot of these culture war battles and whatnot?
Yeah, I would object just a little bit to the characterization of some of these things as outside of politics, because I don't think any of these things are outside of politics. Questions of religion and culture war and questions of identity and all these things. I think these are very much political topics. And but to answer the question, I don't think there's any particular neoliberal stance on whether you should be religious or not.
Yeah.
We certainly have some religious members. We're a membership organization. If you're interested in learning more about us, you can go to neoliberalproject.org and become a member. But we have members who are quite religious. We have members who are atheists. We have members who are, kind of the fuzzy spiritual but not religious. So there's nothing in neoliberalism that requires you to be one way or the other. When it comes to the culture war issues, I'm going to refer only to what I know in terms of the culture war as it exists in America, because every country has their own weird culture wars going on. But in America, the neoliberals will generally take the social liberal stance on most issues, whether it is LGBT questions of LGBT rights or autonomy. They're almost always going to end up taking the socially liberal stance on that. Whether it's questions of abortion has been in the news recently. Separation of church and state is something else you mentioned. On these, we're almost always taking the liberal position that I guess in that sense would align us with the U.S. Democratic Party.
Yeah, going back to when talking about left or right, when I talk about it, I think the terms are generally useless other than talking in general terms. I generally think of the left as being organized when you look at like the loud activist intellectuals. They are generally organized around wanting to destroy capitalism. That's not to say everyone on the left is motivated by that. Obviously, you might have neoliberals. Obviously, you have more moderates who are favorable toward capitalism, but they might see what the right is bringing to the table. They're like, we don't want any part of that. And then I think the right is mostly organized around merely opposing the left. That doesn't mean that the right wants to save capitalism. In fact,
there's
a lot of elements on the right are becoming increasingly anti-capitalism. But
there's a famous Brian Kaplan observation. Do you know Brian Kaplan?
Yeah.
He's a libertarian blogger and economist. And his formulation of the right and the left is that the left hates markets and the right hates the left.
Yes.
And that explains 80 to 90% of politics.
Yeah, I remember an article I often invoke on this is from Current Affairs magazine, which is a pretty lefty magazine, and they're a lot of Marxists write for them. And I remember they spelled it out as they were talking about the difference between liberals and leftists. And they said liberals see capitalism as this amazing machine that maybe needs to be updated and fixed every few years. Leftists see capitalism as a death machine that needs to be smashed to bits. And I thought that was a pretty good way of summing it up. But yeah, this is a reason why I try to focus. I'll often talk about the left and the right, but I try to focus more on like intellectual movements within each camp, so to speak. So and I think I see neoliberal. They're like one of these movements that I'm liking, and I'd like to see neoliberals have a greater influence on what is considered the so-called left today.
Yeah, and I mean, look, it's funny. I think in a U.S. context for current American politics, most of our members align themselves with the Democratic Party because they see the Republican Party as basically so far gone that they're just not interested. Something I say a lot is that I wish we had a healthier conservative movement in the United States. I don't think we do, but I wish we did. I wish there was a sane Republican Party, but I look at the Republican Party and I don't see any sanity there. I see people attempting to overthrow elections, and we can make fun of people who are hysterical about that, but that's a thing that actually happened. And it's weird that we almost kind of just let it go by and we don't really talk about like it was not that far from actually happening. 2 or 3 people making different decisions, and history could have gone very differently. But so not to get into all that, but in modern American politics, most of us align ourselves with the Democratic Party, both because there's a wing of the Democratic Party that we like, along with a wing that we don't like. There are virtually no wings in the GOP that we like. And so whereas in modern American politics, you could say that we're like center left, there's also an argument for us being center right in the sense that we are very pro-capitalism. But it depends on what scale are you using? What are you judging it by? What's your frame of reference?
Yeah, what would you say are the elements of the Democratic Party that you don't like? One obvious example is the rise of what are called the Democratic Socialists, and they try to package themselves under we just want whatever Denmark has. But then when you look at Democratic Socialists of America and what they believe and stuff that they have, they on their own websites, they used to sell Karl Marx merchandise. They have at times. Some of their chapters have held book clubs where they read books written by Mao Zedong, one of the most brutal dictators in history. And I think there are 5 members of the House of Representatives who are affiliated with this organization, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And
so I'll give you 2 answers here. One is probably the boring expected answer. One might be a little bit more interesting. The boring expected answer is that, yeah, the things that we don't like in the Democratic Party are the DSA, the left wing of the party. We are not the left wing of the party. We are I hate saying the centrist, because centrist implies that you only have your beliefs relative to two axes and you just pick a point in the middle. But relative to other Democrats, we are closer to the center. So I'll just use that word. What we dislike about them is kind of this trend that I call maximalism, where, okay, there's a recognition that sometimes government can do good, whether that's regulating pollution to fix a market failure or redistributing some from the rich to the poor to some degree, because we think that's socially optimal. Okay, the government can do some good. But then there's a wing of the Democratic Party that basically takes this to a maximal stance that says, well, all taxes are good. All redistribution is good. All regulation is good. The only way that this tax could be better, or this program could be better, is if it was bigger. That's the only way to criticize something, is to say it was bigger. There was one of the fun things I like to pull up as an example in the 2020 primary, trying to figure out who's going to be the Democratic candidate for president. Elizabeth Warren, who I think exemplifies a lot of this, came out with a 6% wealth tax proposal. And this is well higher than anywhere else in the world, incredibly extreme, completely unworkable as a policy. It's an impossible thing to do. It's absurd and ridiculous. And literally like 3 days later, Bernie Sanders came out with an 8% wealth tax proposal. Just to fuck with her, I guess. Just to be like, well, you can't beat me because I am the real DSA. I am the real socialist here. And again, there's just this attitude of maximalism.
So he just picked 8% just for the sake of one-upping Elizabeth Warren on the
I
same.
literally think that's what happened, because it came 3 days later. Like, it would be a hell of a coincidence. So that's the boring answer, though. The center left of the Democratic Party thinks that the left is too extreme. Okay, I think it's a fair criticism, but it's also expected. One of the more interesting things that I think is potentially a little bit more under the radar, I think that Democrats locally, they have control of most of America's cities, and I think that they're pretty poor at administering those cities. I think just about every city in the United States of any reasonable population is governed by Democrats, because we have an urban-rural divide in America. The rural areas vote Republican, urban areas vote Democrat. And so if you look at like the top 25 cities, I think like 23 or 24 out of the top 25 cities by population are governed by Democrats, something like that. And God, do they often do an awful job.
Not only that, but a lot of these cities have been governed by Democrats for decades, uninterrupted by any Republican challengers.
Yeah. So specifically the areas that I think are really poorly managed by Democrats are housing is the biggest one. Housing policy in America has been screwed up by generations of NIMBYs. And it's just not in a good place. And Democrats have nobody to blame for like the state of San Francisco but themselves. Yeah. And, America, just about every big city in America has a housing crisis, either a minor, moderate, or severe one. But this is on Democrats for not allowing enough housing to be built. And we're kind of drowned in these layers of process and regulation where we have to have community hearings. We have to go before the community board. There's got to be a city council meeting. We need a zoning or, ordinance provision changed. And there's, on some level, a lot of American cities are drowning in process, in community input. There's also things where we can't build infrastructure very well in this country, regardless of whether you are a hardcore libertarian who doesn't want the government to spend any money or not. If the government is going to spend money, I'm sure you'd prefer to do it efficiently and well. You'd prefer to get lots of trains and subways and bridges and ports for your money, as opposed to few subways and bridges and trains and ports for your money. And America is almost uniquely bad at spending our money efficiently. It's not an impossible thing to do. Plenty of other governments do it pretty well, but America does not. And so that's the other criticism that I would have of the Democratic Party, is that I don't think that the Democratic Party takes efficiency and just building well enough. I do think there's a movement to address this. You see people like Ezra Klein has been talking about supply side progressivism, or sometimes he calls it a liberalism that builds. We need a liberalism that builds in America. I think Derek Thompson at The Atlantic has written about what he calls it the abundance agenda, where, you know, if progressives have to stop talking so much about redistribution and start just talking about how do we create abundance. Matt Iglesias writes about this a lot as well. So I think there's a movement to address it, which we are part of. But that's one of the criticisms I would have about Democrats, is an inability to build and to build efficiently.
Yeah, this is a common problem I see in California. Obviously, I've lived here since 2013, and the housing situation just keeps getting worse and worse. I noticed that there was there are 3-bedroom areas in my neighborhood that just a few years ago were going for less than 400,000, and now some of them are pushing 600,000. I'm like, this is just insanity. And this is an issue I've talked about before. It's not only NIMBYism, but it's this what we have in California called the California Environmental Quality Act, which I'm sure you know about this. It's not so much that it takes a long approval process, but the law has been used as a club by pressure groups, including
it very much is, though. So there's different things. Like NEPA is the national version of this, right? The National Environmental Protection Act. CEQA is kind of a California version of NEPA,
and it was signed by Ronald Reagan, by the way.
Yeah, the average NEPA. So there's different levels of what you can get, right? With NEPA, you can have to do just a quick thing. You can have to do an environmental assessment, or if you're really unlucky, you'll have to do an environmental impact statement.
Yep.
And if you have the bad luck to your project is deemed major and you have to do an environmental impact statement, the average length of time that those take is 4.5 years.
Yeah.
It takes 4.5 years on average just to complete an environmental impact statement. And you think about, like, what does that do to the state of big projects? What does that do to the high-speed rail that's supposed to connect Southern California to Northern California? It doesn't exist. It goes from like Bakersfield to Fresno or some horrible shit like that, where it's never going to happen. It's going to cost $200 billion and still not connect all the way, because it takes so long to do anything. And it's so easy to file a lawsuit to just delay for years and years and years and years and years. And look, I'm in New York. Similar problems plague New York. Ours are not as NEPA specific, but here it's just a whole host of factors about the city not being able to manage anything efficiently. And, you know, the Second Avenue subway is famous because it's literally something like 90 years late. It kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed for decades and decades. And when I say 90 years, I'm not exaggerating. It's at least 80 years late.
Wow.
This was something that was begun in like before World War II, I think. And I think the final cost for it, when they actually built out the modern version of it, when it's finally finished recently, it's actually not finished. The first phase of it has finally been finished. It was something like $1.8 billion per kilometer of underground subway, which, you know, you go to Turkey and they can build it for like $100 million per kilometer. You go to Spain, which is a richer country than Turkey, you know, it's like $200 million per kilometer. Here it's 1.8 billion per kilometer. And, you know, there's a whole host of factors that you can get into why that is, but we've got to be better at that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think a reason why, you know, I did a deep dive into this issue last year, and you know, I remember there was a report by the Legislative Accountability Office here in California back in 2015 that said that California really has been behind by 200,000 units per year in the big city, 200,000 units per year. And it would take building 200,000 more above that every year to even start to catch up. And now it's 7 years later, and I don't think there's been any improvements. And you can see that with the way the price of housing just keeps going up and up. And as you said, I remember reading that this was a problem for the Bay Area transit system in Northern California.
Are you in Northern Cal or Southern?
I'm in Southern California.
LA or San Diego?
LA.
Gotcha. Yeah. No, I mean, we just straight up, you got to have more housing. You can talk, the people in my coalition like to talk about like
sorry to cut you off, but
affordable housing, and we've got to be affordable. Some people want public housing. And look, like at this point, anybody who's going to build anything, I'm not going to say no to, because we have such a shortage of units at this point. But it really is. It's not about what kind of housing you build. You just have to build more units. You have to build more housing, or else this is never going to stop. So, yeah.
Yeah, and there are a lot of people, I think, on the left who think the solution is just, increasing welfare benefits or raising the minimum wage. I remember seeing a meme going around earlier this year saying like, oh, the price of housing has tripled since 2011. And they think the solution is doubling the minimum wage. And it's like, well, with the rate housing has increased, you would have to increase the minimum wage to $50 an hour. But that still doesn't address the supply problem, which is the root cause of the housing crisis, especially here in California. And reading Michael Schellenberger's book, San Francisco, he talks about how in San Francisco, they spend roughly $32,000 per homeless person just on housing alone. And homelessness is still a big problem in an area like San Francisco. So it's like, it's not just about doling out more money or trying to artificially increase wages through legislation. You just got to build new housing. And the reason why we don't have new housing is because of too much red tape, NIMBYism and whatnot. And the reason why I think it doesn't get solved is because Democrats often rely on support from environmentalist activists and unions and NIMBYs who I think like the current situation. Like the unions often use CEQA as a club to hold up development so that they can get prevailing wage deals. I remember reading that there was one project in California where they got CEQA lawsuits filed by two different unions looking to shake them down. And I think Democrats are kind of tepid at angering the environmentalist activists and the construction unions in the state, and probably a lot of wealthy donors who are probably NIMBYs, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, housing is something of a signature issue for us. We are pretty much all in on build more housing, obliterate zoning, death to NIMBYs, all that kind of stuff. So more than happy to talk about it for hours and hours if you want to, but we are all in on that.
Republicans are exactly good on this. I remember seeing I think it was the former Republican governor of North Carolina doesn't like that. Like a lot of these new developments might threaten the beloved suburbs that they really like.
Yeah, this is a weird cross-cutting issue, YIMBYism versus NIMBYism. You have a lot of right and left YIMBYs and a lot of right and left NIMBYs. And a lot of it, I think, is sometimes more just, I don't know, it's an interesting issue. I think it's more about entrenched interests than it is about ideology sometimes, in terms of if you're a homeowner, regardless of your ideology, you would love to do things that make your home's value go up. If you're a renter, that doesn't apply as much. But yeah.
Yeah, another issue I see you guys really big on is the consequences of international trade. And you guys also seem to be loud advocates, from what I've seen, of increasing nuclear energy. What would you, I know we talked a lot about housing. I know we just said that's an important issue. What do you think, what are the most important issues to focus on today? Are there any under discussed issues that you think neoliberals and that you would see more Americans like to focus on?
Yeah. So what are the most important political issues today? The first thing I'll mention is that I think, at least for me, and I think for most people that are in our camp, I have a phrase I like to use, that institutions are more important than policy. It does not matter if you get a good policy result if you burned down the institutions that brought you there. And so the overriding concern for me right now, more than anything else, is protecting American democracy. Again, talking mostly in American context. Would I trade? What if Donald Trump said, actually, I'm going to give you all the YIMBYism and immigration and trade you want, but I'm going to do this and kind of install a weird pseudo dictatorship in America? That's not a worthwhile trade to make. Institutions come first. So with that out of the way, the policies that I think are the most impactful, what's going to actually have the most impact on people's lives, I would highlight three things that I think are the most important. Number one is housing. I am a housing truther, and that I think the lack of housing kind of it impacts everything. Housing is part of the reason that that I think there's so much pessimism about the economy all the time, even though the economy has been growing steadily for ever. People don't feel like they are participating in that growth if their rent is growing at the same rate that their salaries are. They don't feel like they have a stake in that economic growth. So I think that housing contributes to that. I think the housing crisis contributes to increased inequality. I think we pretty definitely say that. Housing crisis makes climate change worse because the denser you live, the denser a city is, the more climate friendly that is. The housing crisis makes economic growth lower because it means that people can't move to the really superstar cities where growth and technology and invention are happening. San Francisco should be twice the size that it is. We should have twice as many people inventing companies there and making new startups. And it's not happening. Maybe they're doing it in other places, but there's a lost value there. Like the effects of agglomerating in one city are real. That's why companies do it. It's why one city is known for one thing, another city is known for that. It's because there's real economic benefit to specialization like that. And when you have a housing crisis, you just can't do that. So number one is housing, in that I think housing affects everything. It affects mobility. People don't realize this because I don't know why, but maybe it's just the set of people I hang around with. But literal physical mobility, do you move from one place within America to another place, is way down. Our generation moves less than our parents' generation did by a significant amount. And that, again, that has consequences for economic growth. And
I think some people actually like that too. From what people think that if you're born and grow up in a certain area, they talk as if you have some inalienable right to live there for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and that to me, I don't know. I'm very frustrated with that sort of talk. That I was born here, I get to control what happens here, kind of thing. But so housing is number one that I would call out. Number two would be immigration. I think increased immigration is as close to a free lunch as in national policy as we're going to get, other than perhaps building more housing. But increased immigration has so many benefits in terms of increased economic growth and dynamism, that the negative effects largely don't exist, and where they do exist, they're quite small compared to the benefits that accrue. So immigration would be number two. Number three would be acting on climate change, because climate change is a huge issue, and we're going to need a giant international effort to try to not stop it, but try to stem the worst of the damage. Because if we don't, you're going to start getting into the hundreds of billions of dollars of damage per year. And at this point, it's like, what can we mitigate? Can we transition to clean energy faster? Because just being able to, move away from fossil fuels 5 years faster, if we could accomplish that, if we get there by 2045 instead of 2050, would mean an enormous amount of human suffering that we avoid all over the world. So those are the three that I would say: housing, immigration, and climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a lover of fossil fuels. I don't know if we agree on climate change, but from what I see, the neoliberals, they seem to have at least pretty reasonable solutions to reducing CO2 emissions. You talked about it with urbanization. This is something I was reading environmental law journals that talked about when you don't have densely populated, when you don't build these complexes where there are shopping centers on the bottom, one, you're making it less affordable to live in the city. So if people have to live an hour outside of the city, they have to drive all the way in. Whereas if you built a lot of more housing in the city with the shops, and I forget what the term for it is called, but if you're going to live there, you're much less likely to get in a car and burn CO2 to get around, to get your groceries and enjoy your.
I live, the greenest city in America is New York City.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who live in rural areas that are like, I live in the middle of a field. How can you be greener than me? And sorry, but it's true. I don't own a car, for one. I walk everywhere I go. And if I have a longer trip, it's the subway. But that's just how I am compared to, for instance, being in LA, which is the car culture capital of the world, kind of. Um, and again, I'm not trying to cast judgment on anybody, because if you live in LA, it's a necessity of life that you have to have a car.
Yeah.
But the faster that we can transition away from emitting CO2 to power those cars, the right way to do this politically is not to tell people like you need to be poorer in order to save the world. That doesn't work. The right way to do it is to invest heavily in accelerating solar power and accelerating wind power and using nuclear power and accelerating the development of electric vehicles and battery technology and all this stuff. We have to invent the technology that's going to get us there, because otherwise, look, if the world is going to be screwed if we just continue on a path where we just pump out huge amounts of CO2 with for another several decades. If we don't change that, which the world is changing it, maybe not fast enough, but if we don't change it, it's not going to be a pretty picture.
Yeah, I remember when I lived in the North Hollywood area. I didn't live in one of those fancy one of those fancy complexes I mentioned earlier, but there were some of those in my area, and I lived within walking distance of a major subway station. So I barely drove when I lived in North Hollywood, when I was much closer to subway systems and just everything, like from restaurants, movie theater to grocery stores. There were like 3 7-Elevens within walking distance. I barely had to drive anywhere. Even when I wanted to go to a Lakers game at Staples Center, I didn't have to get in my car and drive 10 miles down and like sit in traffic for 2 hours. Just walk to the subway station, get off in downtown, and I'm burning for fewer fossil fuels by doing that. So I think more reasonable housing policy, and I just think freeing up the market and developing more nuclear energy, just like and electric cars and technology. Another thing about neoliberals, you guys seem to be very positive about technology and innovation. That's much more reasonable to me than when I see someone like Greta Thunberg go to the United Nations and say, "I don't want to hear about your technical solutions. I just want everyone to panic and lose their mind."
If you're righteous enough, it doesn't matter what the solution is.
Exactly.
No, I mean, look, there's a place for righteous anger. I think that if you're a 13-year-old growing up and you are being told, well, the world might be screwed because of what your parents and grandparents did, like, okay, I can understand there's righteous anger, but you want that funneled towards something productive, not towards just screaming into the wind. That in the end, we're very kind of philosophically like consequentialist. If you want to get into the philosophical debates with like deontology versus utilitarianism or consequentialism, we skew very heavily towards consequentialism in terms of it doesn't matter whether you're morally right. It matters whether you are getting things done. Like, what impact does this policy have on the world? It doesn't matter if it's the most incredible sounding policy or the policy that fits your priors or conforms to your ideology. It doesn't work. Is this having the impact on the real world that we want it to? It's a big emphasis for us. So it's why we kind of emphasize housing so much, and all the community input that sounds reasonable on the face of it isn't actually very good for us, because what is the actual impact? What is one of the things I like to say about NEPA and CEQA? I'm actually writing an article on this right now. I'm not sure where it's going to get published, but there's a lot of instances where NEPA is actually anti-environmental, where NEPA is specifically. Actually, hold on. Let me see if I can pull this up real quick.
Hang
with me for 1 second.
Last year.
Let me see if I have this. I do. Okay, so I have a list here because I pulled it up because I'm in the middle of writing this article. I have a list of like 20 different instances where not just NEPA or CEQA have been used to, like get in the way of a project being built, but specifically in the way of an environmental project specifically. So I'm just going to list a couple of them off. There's it's been used to block nature trails. It's been used to block congestion pricing in New York City. It's been used to block wind power projects in Martha's Vineyard. It's been
Let me
used to
guess. Can I
block.
guess? Is it because it's going to kill the birds?
It's something like that. Yeah. I mean, I don't need, I'd have to go through each one. It's been used to block hydroelectric dams,
Yep.
clean water projects, high speed rail trains, California solar, a different solar in Nevada, hydropower in Canada. It's been used to block lake restorations, like depollutioning of lakes. Like this is there are NEPA lawsuits and CEQA lawsuits on all of these, where it's literally an anti-environmental bill.
Wow.
It drives me crazy. And again, it says it's environmentalism, but what impact is it actually having on the world?
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of environmentalists they want to reduce human impact in the name of preserving nature. And I even see this with there's another desalination plant debate being had in California, and the people who are opposing it are environmentalists. And it's like, well, wait a minute, don't we want more clean drinking water for human consumption? Aren't we being told that like droughts are going to be a consequence of burning too much CO2? Shouldn't we try to mitigate that as much as possible by maybe building some more
Yeah.
desalination plants?
There's a generational thing here, because environmentalists in the 70s, if you think about old style environmentalism, they're very much about stopping things.
Yeah.
And to be fair, there was some heinous shit in the 70s where people were just, hey, you got a chemical plant. Well, we've got a river next door. Let's just dump it all in there. Like that actually happened quite a lot.
I don't think that should be allowed.
Like we've all seen pictures of the Cleveland River on fire. Yeah. Like that's a thing that happened. So I don't know. Did you watch like Captain Planet growing up in the 90s?
Yes.
Like what? And again, Captain Planet, it's always some like evil businessman is the villain, and they're like doing landfills and like dumping toxic chemicals and stuff. So we grew up in 70s, 80s, 90s with this environmentalism of stopping things.
Yeah.
Maybe for understandable reasons at the time, but it's the only thing that the environmental movement ever learned was how to stop things. And they never learned how to build things. And the current environmental crisis has moved on. You know, environmentalism used to be save the whales, stop pollution, fix the hole in the ozone layer, right? And we've actually done a pretty good job of all those things.
Well, you know who was one of the biggest savers of whales in human history was J.D. Rockefeller, because before we started refining oil into kerosene for home lighting, people were hunting whales for blubber to do that.
Yep. But so my message to the environmentalists is you won most of those battles. The hole in the ozone layer is actually getting better. It has been for a decade. We won. It's getting better. It's going to heal. Pollution has gone way down. The EPA, inaugurated by Richard Nixon of all people, has actually done a great job at reducing lead in American life, and particulate matter in the air has gone down. We're winning that. Landfills aren't as bad as they used to be, but we still have this environmentalism, despite those victories, that is focused on stopping things, whereas the current challenge is about climate change. And what we need to fix climate change is to build things. We need to build cities that are denser. We need to build transit for those cities so that people can go on electric trains and subways rather than cars. We need to build solar and wind energy plants at massive scale. We need to build nuclear. We need to even be trying things like we need to be experimenting with carbon capture technology and geothermal energy production and things like that. Like these are all things that we should be trying, but we don't have an environmentalism that is set up to build things and to create things. We have an environmentalism that, because of generational experience, is just set up to stop things.
Yeah.
Someone in my chat is saying we need to build a giant space umbrella to just stop the excess sun. That, if it works, it works. I don't.
Yeah, I think to the extent that burning CO2 will cause problems, we should be using science, reason, and technology to mitigate those problems as much as we possibly can. What sort of successes have neoliberals? Have you seen any successes as of late? Have you guys gained a lot of subscribers and members to your organization? Have you guys had success on, say, organizing on college campuses or getting politicians elected in certain areas?
Yeah. So the actual project has been growing over the last few years. We're only a couple years old. we started as kind of an online space in 2017, but literally when I say an online space, we were a subreddit and nothing else. Like, we were not a formal organization. We didn't really become an organized thing until early 2020. And that's when we kind of hired our first person full time to actually help run the Neoliberal Project. And we have 3 people now working full time. So we're a young organization. In that time, we have been growing. We've got something like 50 to 70 active chapters around the country and the world. So, we'll have the New York City New Liberals, or the Chicago Neoliberals, or the Taiwan Neoliberals. We've got all these chapters, and they're doing all sorts of local activism. They're petitioning their cities for better housing policy. They're canvassing for members of Congress that they want to protect and want to reelect. They're, in some instances, it's trying to get members of Congress out rather than protect them. But they're doing just all this kind of local activism, local volunteering, trying to make an impact in their communities. We have more members every few months. I check the membership numbers, and it's gone up. So it's encouraging to see that it is kind of growing, and we're starting to have some members run for local offices. I think we have 1 or 2 people who've got like pretty small stuff. I'm on my city's school board. I'm on my city's kind of Democratic Council, Democratic Party chairmanship. I'm on, we have a couple people who ran for state assembly this year in their states. I don't think they ended up winning, unfortunately, but we are starting to get some of that going.
Hell yeah. Now, I remember I asked you, when I asked you to come on, I only asked you for an hour of your time. I'm probably going to hang out for another hour. I didn't know if you want to hang out, maybe answer questions from the chat, but if not.
Yeah, I mean, I can hang out for a little bit more if there's questions from your chat or from anybody. Yeah.
Well, I would like, I think you've probably already mentioned this first, but like, where can people find you and learn more about the Neoliberal Project?
So you can follow us at Neoliberal on Twitter. There is a 0 instead of the O. We're still very bitter about that. The actual at Neoliberal is like an old account that has not tweeted in like 12 years or something. And the rules of Twitter say that, I don't know, we're not allowed to have it, or I don't know. But it's at Neoliberal, just with a 0 instead of the O in Neo. You can go to neoliberalproject.org and learn more about us. We have a podcast called the Neoliberal Podcast that I host, and I like to think we have some interesting conversations there. We've had Nobel Prize winning economists, Pulitzer Prize winning journalists, members of Congress, leading thinkers and authors and things like that. So all of those places are places where you can find us.
Yeah, it's funny. So I'm a student of Objectivism, which is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. And I remember earlier today when I was looking more into you guys, I saw that Robert Trzynski, who's another objectivist, like interviewed you, and you talked about a lot of the same stuff. I'm like, I wonder if he thinks that like I just copied Robert's homework and I'm just doing a rerun.
Well, we have a lot of what I would say are like ex-libertarians. And I know objectivist is not exactly the same thing as libertarian, but I'm going to pretend that they are for now, because there's heavy overlap at the very least. But I would say that there's a lot of our members who kind of considered themselves libertarians in a former life. I'm one of them. I'm one of the founders of the movement, and at 16 years old, I sent $25 to the Libertarian Party so I could be a registered member of the Libertarian Party. So I was a teenage libertarian. I like to joke that I grew out of it, but if you'll forgive me for that.
But back in 2020, I sent $20 to Justin Amash's presidential campaign, and then he canceled it 2 weeks later. I'm like, you dick.
I like Justin Amash. I think he's a good guy, but no. So I am not a libertarian anymore, but I consider myself to still have libertarian instincts that are valuable in a lot of ways. One thing that I say a lot is that I think the Republican Party needs to be more libertarian, and I think the Democratic Party needs to be more libertarian, and I think the Libertarian Party needs to be a lot less libertarian. So that if you're a libertarian, if you're a committed like NAP kind of non-aggression principle person, I might not sway you. But there's a lot of libertarians out there who just want their ideas represented in mainstream politics. And I look at somebody like on the Democratic side, like Jared Polis, who's the governor of Colorado, who I think is probably the most effective libertarian that America's had in 40 or 50 years, maybe.
Yeah, I think he's definitely, out of all the Democrats, I think he's definitely one of the better ones.
Yeah, and look, if you are a libertarian who actually wants to be effective rather than sitting around doing third-party runs and debating whether you can get 0.5% or 1.5% of the vote, the Jared Polis pipeline, I think, is your model, because he's doing a lot of things that you might not agree with. He expanded universal pre-K to educate all the 4-year-olds in Colorado, which I think is a good thing. But he's also reforming drug laws there, and reducing penalties. And marijuana is legal now. And now I think they might even be moving towards legal shrooms in marijuana or in Colorado. He's doing things like reforming occupational licensing so that you don't need these ridiculous 1,500 hours of training to be like a cosmetologist, or 1,200 hours of training to be a florist. He's reforming a lot of that. He's extremely business friendly. He's lowered taxes in some instances. So I think Jared Polis is this great fusion of, like, you can spend money to help people, but you can also get the regulatory state out of the way in instances where it's, it doesn't make sense to have it there. It's actually just hurting things.
I think out of all the Democrat governors, I think he was like one of the first to really start to scale back COVID restrictions, especially after people were starting to get vaccinated. Whereas even here in like Los Angeles, I remember even if you were vaccinated, they were still having like local mandates. Like even if you're vaccinated, you still have to put on a mask to go into a business. And it's just like, well, I got the shot. Why do I need this? But you mentioned education. One of my viewers, Abyss, asks, how do neoliberals feel about school choice?
I would say that it's not like a defining issue for us, but in general, we're pretty friendly to it.
Okay.
So we're part of, it's funny, we're part of a think tank called PPI. That's who funds us, is the Progressive Policy Institute. And despite the name progressive, they're actually considered a very moderate Democratic think tank. It's funny, they come from the old Bill Clinton, like late 1980s, early 1990s kind of wave, back when liberal was a bad word. You didn't want to be tarred as a liberal in like 1989 or 1991. So instead they were like, well, we'll be progressives, because back then it meant like Teddy Roosevelt kind of. So it's funny how the connotations have switched. Now progressive codes is more left than liberal, but we work for we're part of a think tank called PPI, and we're like one project within that think tank. And another project is called Reinventing America's Schools. So if the listener in question is interested, they can Google Reinventing America's Schools. And that is a project out of PPI that focuses on school choice and charter schools and that whole movement. I think that there are some instances when charter schools have been implemented very, very poorly. Yeah. And there's been abuses and just waste. And there are ways to do school choice and charter schools that are not good. But I think there are ways to do it that are good. And as we discover which ways work and which ways don't work, more experimentation and more kind of implementation of school choice is good. And even I think it helps public schools better. Even if we're not going to get rid of public schools, having, charter schools out there experimenting and trying new models of education and seeing what works. Some of them are going to be miserable failures, and some of them might be great, because if you try 100 things, that's how it works. But if you have that experimentation going on, you should be able to implement some of those ideas that actually do work in public schools, and that should make public schools better. So, I think in general, we're pretty friendly to school choice and pretty positive on just that whole idea.
It's an interesting take. Yeah, one of my big issues with the public school system is that they have like a near monopoly on education, and I think as a consequence, there has been like a serious lack of competition when it comes to stuff like what's the approach to educating kids. And I think John Dewey's model, which I think has been very bad, I would like to see more competition from thinkers like Maria Montessori and other
Yeah.
approaches to education. And so that's why I would favor more of a school choice system, which I think has to be more settled on the local level just because of the way the system is set up in the United States. It is more of a local and state level thing. And I'd like to see more competition in this area because I think it's
Yeah.
needed.
And I mean, it's one of those things where, again, you have to get into a philosophy of what are markets actually for? What are they good at and what are they not good at? And markets are good at breeding innovation. They're good at trying new things. And if those new things work out, then you've discovered something awesome and you can advance society. But there are downsides to markets. Think about restaurants. If you open 100 new restaurants, probably 80 of them will fail miserably.
Yeah.
20 of them will end up being interesting and people will like them and they'll multiply and you'll get more of that. And the consequence is you get more of the food that people actually want to eat because you did experimentation and use markets. But 80 of them did fail. And if we think about now, port this analogy over towards schools, are we really happy if we have like 100 charter schools and 80 of them failed miserably and now all these kids have horrible educations and are set back for life? That's a downside we need to consider, that if we're thinking about competition seriously, one of the points of competition is to drive out the bad ones. And there's necessarily going to be some kids who get caught in the crossfire there, and that's a very serious consequence. So
Yeah.
a pure market system I'm not sure would work, but we want to figure out some way to introduce that element of competition and get those benefits of new ideas while still having some degree of protection, where if some kids' parents send them to some junk school, that they're not going to be set back for life. And the details are going to be hard to work out, but there's probably some way we can make that happen.
I think that was the only question. Someone asked, "Is that a train in the background?" earlier when we heard sirens. So
yeah, it's just living in Midtown Manhattan. We had some sort of, I think it was actually a fire truck. I think there's actually a fire a few blocks down from me, but who knows? There's always sirens going on.
Anyway, I asked you everything I wanted to ask today. Yeah, unless you have any questions for me or any other topics you'd like to discuss, it was very fun having you on and learning more about neoliberalism. I hope the viewers learn more about neoliberalism and what you guys stand for. And thanks for coming on today, Jeremiah.
Well, thanks for having me, Kirk. Glad to be here.
All right. Yeah, I'll see you around and keep up the good work.
Awesome. Thank you.